So welcome everyone to this week's ZEF colloquium. Today we have my colleague Eva-Marie Memken. It's my pleasure to introduce her to you. Eva is currently assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen. And she's done her PhD at the University of Göttingen in agricultural economics. And after that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University and the University of Minnesota. And her research focuses mainly on global agri-food systems and proliferation of standards and contract farming. And today she will present a work that we have been doing together on producer organizations. And for you to know, so this presentation is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, please feel free to turn off your cameras and then just use the chat function afterwards to ask questions. So Eva, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, at least virtually. It's a pity that I can't be there in person because it would have been great to meet some of you in person. But well, it's great to be here virtually also. And thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm happy to present our new paper on producer organizations and rural development today, which is joint work with Lisa, who's working at IFAD in Rome, Gautam, who's a colleague here at Copenhagen, and you all know Georgie. I don't have to introduce him. So producer organizations are really seen as a crucial institution to promote sustainable development, especially in lower income countries and in rural areas, because of several reasons. One is that collective action facilitates the access to input, services, and markets, which in many situations is very difficult for individual smallholders because of market and policy failures. Also, collective management of natural resources, of course, becomes much more important in the face of climate change. And producer organizations also offer an option to promote community development. So in fact, producer organizations are key partners for many national governments in developing countries. For example, some governments have used producer organizations as a vehicle to distribute subsidized inputs. Also, producer organizations are really promoted by all the big international organizations who also often have programs targeting producer organizations. And the same also holds for bilateral development organizations. Here are two examples from the US and Germany. So of course, if you work with a group of organized farmers, you can reduce transaction costs, and it's much easier than working with individual farmers. The same also holds, of course, for numerous NGOs that also often choose to work with groups instead of individual farmers. So what are producer organizations? Well, we decided to use this broader term. Many people would use the term farmer organizations, but our understanding is that the term producer organization is a bit broader and would also cover non-land-based production, for example, processing. In either case, it's an umbrella term capturing various different legal forms, such as cooperatives, associations, societies, and more informal groups, for example, extension groups or natural resource user groups. Also, producer organizations fulfill different functions, and often they fulfill multiple functions, which could be marketing of farm output, bulk purchase and distribution of farm inputs, farm services such as extension, in some cases also political representation, among others. So there is a very large body of literature on this topic. So first, there's a large body of empirical literature, often based on small case studies. So these studies look at the determinants of participation. So what are the factors that increase the likelihood that any given household would become a member of a producer organization? Also, many studies analyze the effects, where in most cases, these studies would look at income. So comparing the income among those farmers who participate and those who do not participate. Then there are also quite some reviews. So these papers summarize the empirical literature. Despite this very large body of literature, we did identify several research gaps. The first one is that most of these studies focus on the household level and on economic effects, say on prices or income. Also, a surprisingly large number of studies focuses on Ethiopia. So there's a bit of bias in that regard. Also, really almost all of these studies use propensity score matching. And as many of you will know, propensity score matching would not be our first choice of methods if we want to make causal claims. So if we want to make statements such as entering into a producer organization increases income by X%. In that way, we have to say the internal validity of this body of literature is limited. The same also holds for external validity, as again, many of these studies are small case studies, so they focus on a purposefully selected area and often purposefully selected producer organizations. So these results are not necessarily transferable to other communities or countries. And relatedly, many of these studies focus on a small number of producer organizations, and even those that sample a larger number of organizations often pay limited attention to organizational characteristics. Then, of course, the reviews that would synthesize this body of literature would suffer from the same limitations. So what we do here is first we synthesize common findings or results, or what we call myth. You can also call it stylized facts, if you will. And then in the second step, we add new insights, testing some of these myths and adding to them using different data sets, including both secondary and primary data. And in doing so, we address several gaps because our data cover several levels, as I will show you in a second. Also, it covers several countries, so we increase external validity, and also especially our primary data has a lot of detailed information on organizational characteristics, so we can contribute in that regard too. But I should also point out that we are not addressing all of the gaps, so there's still lots of room for more research. So the data that we are using in the following, in terms of secondary data, we use 3 different data sets. The first one comes from the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor, or CGAP, which is a development initiative composed of several organizations. And among other activities, they conduct smallholder surveys in mainly African countries, plus Bangladesh. So these are nationally representative data for smallholder farmers. Then we use LSMS data. These are comprehensive household surveys that are also nationally representative for households in several African countries, and these are panel data. Then we use data from the Peruvian Agricultural Survey, which is a repeated cross-section. So that means households are drawn anew each year as to be nationally representative. In terms of primary data, we use 3 different data sets that my co-authors and I collected in different countries, including Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, and Kenya. So this is to show you the different levels that our data sets cover. So the first one is CGAP data. So it was conducted in these countries. These are cross-sectional data, and we use data from the individual level questionnaires. So that means for each sampled households, one household member was randomly selected, provided that person contributes to household income and is above the age of 15. So here we have many male household heads, but also other household members. Then the Peruvian Agricultural Survey is at the household or farm level and is quite a large data set, as you can see here. Then LSMS data cover these countries and several years. And here we use data from the community level questionnaire, which includes information on producer organizations. We do not use information from the household questionnaire because these questions do not serve our purpose. Our primary data cover both the household and the producer organization level. And this is just, yes, this is to remind me that I should say that all of the households are members, so we don't include any non-members in the same locations. Then these data sets were initially collected for different purposes. So Georgie and I collected data in Côte d'Ivoire to look at the effects of fair trade certification on farmers and workers. So we sampled 50 cocoa cooperatives with an average of 600 members. Goydam collected data in Ethiopia to look at participatory forestry management. So these are forest user groups with an average of 30 members, but these are also farmers, so they use timber and non-timber products. Then Lisa collected data in Kenya to look at nutrition-sensitive approaches to agricultural development, and these are nutrition groups with an average of 20 members. And now I just want to show you what type of data we have available from all of the primary data from all of the 3 services. I don't want to go into detail, it's just to give you an overview what type of information we collected. So we all have information on the function of the producer organization, where these are non-mutually exclusive dummy variables, meaning that a producer organization can fulfill several of these purposes. Then we collected information on external support and formation, on entry barriers, and we have lots of information on members. So these are averages for each producer organization. Well, so the myth we identified based on our expertise on the literature and our reading of the literature. So what we feel are recurrent topics and hypothesis findings that come up again and again in the literature. So in other words, we did not do a systematic literature review as you would do, for example, for a meta-analysis. I think our most interesting results are actually based on descriptive statistics, but we also do some regression analysis, although probably the regression analysis is not like the main contribution of the paper. So we don't have any big econometric advances here. However, we do look at correlates of participation. We look at the association between membership and farm income, and we look at organizational characteristics and how it's correlated with members' income. So here we use different data sets and different models, but all of them are pretty standard. So I think we don't need equations here. I will show you, I will explain again the model specification once we are in the results section. So the 5 myths that we identified are the following. First, marginalized farmers are excluded. Second, producer organizations mitigate market and policy failures by facilitating access to input services and markets. Members benefit. Organizational characteristics differ and matter for outcomes among members. Producer organizations benefit communities at large, including also those who do not participate themselves. So we start with the first one, which is also the longest one. So this one is interesting because producer organizations are promoted precisely because they are seen as poor institutions. So it's kind of surprising that many studies suggest that the poorest households are actually often excluded. I should mention that exclusion, in the way the term is used in this context, also includes self-exclusion. So when a household decides that participation is not feasible, is not attractive, or is not beneficial. So in this body of literature, that would also be termed exclusion. This is important to say because most of the producer organizations have an open membership, although in some cases community membership or land can be a formal requirement. But more important than formal requirements are quasi-requirements that de facto also exclude certain farmers from participation. And the literature here shows quite clearly that it's often the marginalized households, so those with limited social, human, and physical capital that are less likely to participate. So characteristics such as age, education, gender, ethnicity, ties with local authorities, have been shown to predict participation. Interestingly, there also seems to be a middle class effect, meaning that the wealthiest share of households also often don't participate. And here I would argue this should probably really be explained with self-exclusion. So probably very large households and farms have no difficulties to access input and output markets, even without collective action, so that it might be a purposeful decision not to join. So we look at correlates of participation using data provided by CGAP. So here we look at the individual level, and we use linear probability models where the outcome variable indicates whether the individual is a member of a producer organization. So unlike in the literature so far, we have different categories of female members because most of the other studies look at the household level. And here we have female household heads, other female household members, so these could be spouses, and the base category is male household members. So here we can show that it's not only female-headed households, but also other female members within households that are less likely to participate than male household members, which kind of confirms and adds to the existing literature. We can also show the middle class effect because we find there's an inverted U-shaped relationship between land size and participation, although the coefficients are not particularly large here. We do the same at the household level using data from Peru. So here the outcome variable indicates whether the household is a member of a producer organization. And these results are very similar. So again, we can confirm that households with female operators are less likely to participate, although again, the magnitude of the coefficient is relatively small. So since these are linear probability models, this would be about 2% change increase in the likelihood of being a member. But also this Peru, so this would probably look a bit different in other countries. Also, again, we can show the inverted U-shaped relationship between land size and participation. So what has received less attention in the literature is that it might not only be the most marginalized households and household members, but it might also be the most marginalized communities and regions that are excluded. Indeed, there's some anecdotal evidence pointing at just that, so that producer organizations tend to be set up in better off regions with better market access, more favorable agroecological conditions, and institutional stability. So we did look at the geographical distribution of the prevalence of producer organizations. So here in these maps, you can see the proportion of communities with at least one producer organization by region. So the lightish yellow area would mean that in those regions, very few communities have at least one producer organization. And then similarly, darkish brownish areas would mean that in those regions, a large proportion of the community has at least one producer organization. So based on that, we can say that the opportunities to become a member vary regionally, even when we hold household characteristics constant. So I think the logical follow-up question is probably what share of producers actually participate if the most marginalized and the wealthiest ones are excluded and also certain regions are excluded. While previous studies couldn't really calculate participation rates because of the sampling strategies, because members are often oversampled, and of course, many of the data sets are not nationally representative. So we can calculate participation rates, and we do that at different levels. So starting with the left-hand side, we look at the individual level participation rates using CGAP data. And here you see the proportion of individuals who are members. And there's some variation across countries, with Côte d'Ivoire having higher participation rates, but on average across these countries, participation rates are like around 10-ish%. Then on the right-hand side, we look at household level participation rates using data from Peru in different years. And here too, you can see that the participation rates are below 10% and that there's relatively limited variation over time. Same at the community level. So this is kind of equivalent to the maps that you have already seen, just a different way of presenting it and also looking at some yearly differences. So here too, we see some variation across countries, but not so much variation across time. And overall, fewer than 40% of the sampled communities have at least one producer organization. So in some producer participation rates vary across countries, little over time, and they are often surprisingly low. However, these figures are in line with figures that we could find elsewhere. So for example, the only other study that looks at producer organization and uses nationally representative data from Mozambique also suggests that participation rates are quite low. And we also have official figures from Brazil also suggesting that participation rates are around 10%. So we conclude that our figures are quite accurate here. So this is also, I think in comparison, it's interesting to think about some higher income countries. Here I couldn't find participation rates, but these are market shares, but I suppose these two figures would be correlated. So in some countries like Netherlands, Finland, Italy, and France, market shares of cooperatives is really high. So we have to conclude that, and for no lower income country that we have data on, participation rates reach those high participation rates that we see in some higher income countries. It's important to know that especially cooperatives and many, especially in African countries, have a long and troubled history of government control. So that might be one reason why participation rates are also a bit stagnant and not increasing. So we have seen that clearly in Uganda, where many farmers didn't want to belong to a cooperative anymore because they still had the experience of state-controlled cooperatives that still frame their decision. And in fact, governments, NGOs still play a really crucial role. So many studies focusing on particular case studies have shown that the percentage of externally funded producer organizations are often very large, meaning that not so many organizations are funded by farmers themselves. That brings us to the second myth, which was that producer organizations mitigate market and policy failures by facilitating access to inputs, services, and markets. So this really is the key reason why producer organizations are set up and promoted. So we would definitely expect them to deliver on this front. In fact, many studies suggest that this is the case, that producer organizations indeed provide a large, diverse set of services to their members. Although here, again, we have to say that most of this evidence is rather anecdotal, so not all studies really show data on which services are provided and which services are really accessed by farmers. So here we can do that. We have data on service provision by producer organizations. We start with data from Peru. So this is at the household level, and we only look at members. So we excluded all non-members from the sample. And also this only refers to services provided by producer organization. So this does not include other service providers such as the government. I don't want to go into detail. I just want to highlight a few things. One is that the most frequently named service that members access from producer organizations in Peru is technical advice. And others are not very common, such as financial services. Also, this last part here shows us that around 40% of the members don't receive any of the services at all. Then we do the same at the individual level. So here we use CGAP data, and again, we only look at members. So we exclude everyone who is not a member of a producer organization. So here too, farming advice seems to be the most frequently accessed service provided by producer organizations, and surprisingly little of the farmers mention marketing of input and output. That's a bit surprising because those are often the key arguments why producer organizations are promoted. When we look at the community level, again, we only have communities, we include communities here that have at least one producer organization. So this would be the proportion of communities with a producer organization. No, that is not correct. Well, however, so these figures are a bit different because here we see that commercialization of agricultural output seems to be the most important one. So there's a gap between this figure and the other two figures that I showed you before, and that might be explained by side selling. So although producer organizations may offer marketing as a service, not all producers are really also make use of that service and prefer to sell to other buyers who might offer a better price. That brings us to the third one, which states that members benefit. And here we have really a large body of literature, empirical studies, but also recent reviews. So especially this recent one from like just last year, that one really did lots of work for us. Summarizing the evidence in a very good way. So several studies look at adoption of technology and input and suggest that those farmers who are members have higher adoption rates. Also, studies suggest that members tend to have higher yields and higher productivity, quite a good difference, 20% here. Similarly, studies have suggested that members have better access to higher value markets and market a higher share of their agricultural production. Findings on prices are a bit mixed, and that might be linked to what I just mentioned about side selling. So in some cases, the price is not really higher, the price that is offered by the producer organization, so that farmers may prefer to sell to other buyers. However, other studies have suggested that producer organizations may provide more stable prices over time, so this could act as a risk reduction strategy for farmers. Overall, however, most of the studies suggest that income is higher among members than among non-members, although there's quite some variation in the difference, ranging from -3 to 70%. So we also look at the relationship between farm income and membership, and we use Peru data because it's most suitable to do this. So this again is at the household level. The outcome variable is whether the log of annual farm income, and we use different specification where we control for department, province, and district fixed effects. So the district is the largest administrative unit, and then it becomes smaller in column 2 and 3. So we find that there is a positive association between membership and farm income, irrespective of the specification. But as we would expect, the coefficient becomes a bit smaller once we control for more regional differences. So we would probably want to use the most conservative estimate here, which is still quite a large difference, over 50%. However, several studies also suggest that not everyone benefits equally from membership, meaning that there's quite some impact heterogeneity. Although there's disagreement whether large farms benefit more or whether small farms benefit more, and also various other characteristics were discussed as factors that could influence outcomes to a large extent. We suggest, perhaps more importantly, are organizational characteristics, which brings us to the fourth myth, which states that organizational characteristics differ and matter. So far we have looked at averages and general patterns, and I think this is important because the common myth, like the results and findings that repeat across studies, also don't really differentiate by size, legal form, or type of crops. So I think it's important to look at general effects and patterns, but we also want to highlight diversity because it is easily overlooked and also difficult to capture. And it's also important to highlight that organizational heterogeneity also exists within subgroups, so even within cooperatives, for example. So organizational characteristics, some of the ones that are that seem to be very important, and also where organizations differ a lot, are characteristics such as leader commitment, leader skills, leader turnover, financial resources, and institutions to increase transparency, accountability, something like management plan and member requirements. So of course, these organizational characteristics would determine what type of services the organization is able to provide to its members. Also, these organizational characteristics would determine what type of members an organization attracts and what type of outcomes we would expect among members. And also it would determine the challenges facing the organization and also supporters or partners. Of course, these factors all influence each other, so it's really difficult to make any causal claims in this discussion. So, but there are some lessons learned based on the literature, often also based on anecdotal evidence. So one is that leadership and governance are really crucial for outcomes among members, and also that organizations vary to a great extent in this regard. Also, I mentioned it before, many organizations face collective action problems, such as side selling, but also in general, member commitment can be a problem because participatory approaches often are very time intense, and that can be very problematic, especially for poorer members. Elite capture is a problem because many of the organizations are headed by local elites, often men. There seems to be there's some interesting considerations on the trade-off between inclusiveness and efficiency, and also size. Size is a bit more obvious because if you're too small, you don't reach the economies of scale that you would need to be a successful, sustainable organization. Yet if you have too many members, you face lots of organizational challenges. Then on inclusiveness, this is also interesting. So with a couple of studies have been suggesting that those organizations that have no entry barriers where everyone can participate, these organizations are often not very good at delivering benefits to their members. So it seems to be the more the exclusive clubs that are able to provide benefits to their members. There are also important considerations regarding financial resources and external support, because many organizations indeed lack financial resources and depend on external support, which limits their financial sustainability. So that donor-initiated producer organization seem to be the one that do offer more services, although there's also disagreement how many different services a producer organization should really offer. So because it might become difficult to really reach original objectives if producer organizations do too many things that they are not experts on. It was also suggested that better off producer organizations benefit more from support, which also raises the question how much support would be sufficient and how to best target producer organizations. We also look at correlates between organizational characteristics and member characteristics using our primary data from the 3 countries. This is too much to go into detail to. I just want to highlight one thing which we found interesting and also confirming previous evidence, which is like external formation seems to be quite important because it is highly associated with the homogeneity of members. So in those groups, more members have the same religion and ethnic group. Also, they seem to be more participatory, so a larger share of the members attend meetings. And also these members of such organizations seem to have higher agricultural incomes. We can look at that also with a regression framework. So here, our outcome variable is the log of annual agricultural income. We include country dummies because here we pool the data set. And then we look at the association between producer group characteristics and annual income. And here we find that if the organization provides financial services, and again, if it's formatted externally, that increases or that is associated with higher agricultural incomes among members. Also, entry barriers seem to be important, although here the coefficients are not significant, which could be related to the sample size. That brings us to the last one, which is that producer organizations benefit communities at large. So the main argument here is that many of the services that producer organizations provide are non-excludable because it's not feasible or not acceptable to exclude non-members from these services. One good example is information, say on marketing options or prices, because it's infeasible to exclude everyone from sharing from that information or members from sharing information. And also in many cases, non-members can also sell via the producer organization. On the other hand, some of the services that producer organizations are excludable, and that would often hold for financial services, for example, or sometimes also for inputs. So that would mean that we would expect that the income increase among members would be larger than the income increase among non-members, so that as a result, the existence of producer organizations would increase local inequality. And this is very much in line with the literature on certification contract farming and higher value markets in general, where this argument is also often made. However, this has not been looked at empirically, so that spillover effects remain unclear. We are currently looking into that because we found a panel data set from Ethiopia that includes lots of information on both members and non-members and where they access the services. So we might be lucky to be able to provide more evidence soon on this question. So that brings me to the summary of the 5 myths. So the first one was marginalized farmers are excluded, and we confirm this, but we highlight that this also holds for marginalized household members and communities. And relatedly and importantly, we show that participation rates are often quite low, often that one would probably expect. And the second one is that producer organizations mitigate market and policy failures by facilitating access to input services and markets. And here we also say, yeah, this seems to be true, although the range of services is smaller than we often expect. And it's maybe also not necessarily the services we expect producer organizations to provide. The third one was that members benefit, and again, we say this seems to be true. However, there is substantial variation across studies and within producer organizations. And more generally, we have to conclude that the external and internal validity of this literature is limited. So if we want to make any claims about the effect size, how much do members actually benefit, I think we would need much better data and much better methods. The fourth was that organizational characteristics differ and matter. So we say, yes, this is true, but definitely we need more research here. And this is also a costly suggestion because like Jody and I collected data in Ivory Coast among 50 organizations, and that was already a lot of work and very time intense and complicated. And here we are suggesting, okay, we would need a much larger sample of organizations. So that would definitely be very costly and time intense. The fifth one was that producer organizations benefit communities at large, and here we have to say this is really not clear. We don't really have any robust empirical evidence. To conclude, it's easy to agree that well-functioning producer organizations benefit their members. However, few farmers are really members, as we show in this paper, and possibly even fewer ones are members of very well-functioning ones that can generate great benefits for their members. It's also important to ask who can be reached. If you remember the maps that I showed you, showing that in several regions, households don't really have the option to join a producer organization. So I think especially when it comes to programs aimed at distributing subsidized inputs to everyone, producer organizations would probably not be the best vehicle to do so. Of course, there's also always a question of cost-benefit ratio, like how are you investing money to achieve your objective? And investing money in producer organizations is, of course, kind of an indirect way to provide public goods. So you could also argue that this money should be invested in actually providing those public goods and not helping producer organizations to provide those. So we suggest future discussions and research should pay more attention to low participation rates, to the geographical distribution of producer organizations. I think that's a very interesting direction for future research, and producer organizational characteristics. So still a lot of scope to do more research in that regard. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments.